The visual cliff was an experiment performed by Eleanor J. Gibson and Richard D. Walk in 1960 at Cornell University in order to test whether depth perception is a skill that is acquired with experience or if one is born with it. Eleanor Gibson was born on December 7, 1910 in Peoria, Illinois. She was married to one of her psychology professors at Smith College, Jack J. Gibson, in 1932 and later became his teaching assistant. Along with being her husband, Jack J. Gibson served as a good stepping stone to get Eleanor out in the world of psychology. Eleanor J. Gibson received her doctorate from Yale in 1938. She was a very important American psychologist who made significant advances in the field of perception. Dr. Richard Walk was born in Fort Dix, New Jersey in 1920. He received his Ph.D. in psychology from Harvard University and later became part of the Cornell University faculty. He then joined the faculty at George Washington University, being the director of the doctoral program in cognitive and perceptual development. He also served as a department chair. Richard Walk, however, is most widely known for his work with Eleanor Gibson on the visual cliff experiment. The purpose of the visual cliff experiment was to measure whether depth perception is innate or acquired with experience. Gibson and Walk had a contraption built. It was a table about 4 feet high with the top made from a piece of thick, clear glass. Directly under half of the glass on the shallow side of the table was a solid surface with a checkered pattern. On the other side of the table, the deep side, the same checkered pattern appears. However, it is at the very bottom, 4 feet below. This makes for an appearance of a sudden drop-off, although there is actually glass there to protect any children who choose to step over to the deep end. Gibson and Walk performed this experiment on 36 infants between the ages of 6 and 14 months old, and young animals such as kittens, day-old goats, newly hatched chicks, and rats. The test subjects were set in the middle of the shallow end. The animals were merely observed to see if they would cross to the deep end, and as for the children, their mothers stood on the opposite side beckoning them, encouraging them to cross over to the deep end. Gibson and Walk found that most of the human infants did not cross over to the deep end, despite their mothers' efforts to coax them over. To Gibson and Walk, there was no question that these infants perceived depth. Often they would peer down through the glass of the deep side, then back away, or pat the glass with their hands, and yet still refuse to cross despite the seeming solidity. Depending on which animal was tested, the results varied. Gibson and Walk found that the animal's visual senses were in control and that the animal's ability to feel the solidity of the glass on the deep end had no effect in their response. None of the chicks, baby goats, or kittens made any mistakes in crossing over to the deep side, while the rats showed no perception of depth. Even when a baby goat was set in the middle of the deep side, it became frightened and froze in a defensive posture. With the exception of the rats, none of the animals were convinced of the solidity of the deep side without visual reassurance. The results of this experiment were explained with the evolutionary theory. Because rats are nocturnal and rely on their whiskers and sense of smell rather than on their vision, they had no hesitations in crossing over to the deep side. However, human infants, kittens, chicks, and young goats rely on their vision. For that reason, they remained skeptical of crossing over to the deep end unless they had visual reassurance. The variance in results among the animals who do rely on vision and on human infants was explained with the reasoning that depth perception is acquired at different times for different species according to their lifestyles. Humans, for example, acquire depth perception around 6 months of age, while chickens and goats acquire it in their first day of life. And rats, cats, and dogs acquire depth perception at about 4 weeks of age. Gibson and Walk concluded that the capacity to perceive depth is inborn because to learn it through experience would make for too many potentially fatal accidents. The one main criticism of Gibson and Walk's experiment is the question of whether or not they really did prove that depth perception is innate in humans. Some people argue that since they only tested infants between the ages of 6 and 14 months, the infants had already had the time to learn to avoid such dangerous situations and learn from trial and error. Gibson and Walk were not able to test infants less than 6 months of age, however, because at that time, most infants' locomotor abilities are not up to par. Although the outcome of the visual cliff experiment is questionable, Gibson and Walk's contraption has been significant in the research of perception. The contraption is still used today for research. And Gibson and Walk's experiment has also been cited in recent research studies, such as a study by Berger and Adolf in 2003 on toddlers' perception of height. However, overall, Gibson and Walk's research has developed a clear and systematic way for people to study depth perception.